They have had some. With trench ground fire, so the fire can't get full. Yeah, that'd be great. But they get large. They get so big, take care of it.
I did.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to this session today. We Monmouth College Out of This World presented by Professor Michael Salantai. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. Originally from the Pacific Northwest and having grown up near Seattle, Washington, Michael Salantai earned a BA in Physics at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and was elected to Pi Beta Kappa. His senior thesis was on near-Earth asteroid observations and orbital dynamics. Michael spent 2 years as an R&D engineer working on electron microscope optimization before going on to earn his master's and PhD in astronomy at the University of Washington in Seattle, with his dissertation focusing on observations of comets in large astronomical surveys. After graduation, Michael moved to Chicago to take up a postdoctoral fellowship at the Adler Planetarium and Astronomy Museum. He most recently was physics faculty at Gonzaga University before joining the Department of Physics and Engineering here at Monmouth in 2018. Michael is an active member of the Solar System Science Collaboration for the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, an 8.4 meter telescope under construction in Chile since nearly the collaboration's founding. When not teaching or studying space stuff, he spends time with his wife, their pet rabbits, and is an accomplished hand embroiderer. Please everyone join me in welcoming Professor Michael Salantai.
Hey, thank you. It's always nice to remind myself what I wrote for my biographical sketch there. So this is actually kind of a neat thing for me. The very first activity I ever did when I joined Monmouth College in 2018 was a Golden Scots event. I came out here with my wife to sign all my paperwork and officially become a member of Monmouth. And they're like, hey, we have an alumni group up at the telescope tonight. You want to come up and chat with them? And I did. So if you were here in 2018, I probably met you in the dark. You probably don't recognize me, and I don't recognize. It was very confusing, but it was my, hey, welcome to Monmouth. I literally signed my contract like 3 hours before meeting people on the roof. We're not going up to the roof tonight because we're actually in the exciting process of upgrading our observatory mount. And the telescope's going to be way more functional and way better, and we're going to be able to use it remotely and do all sorts of things with it. We're in the process of updating the mount, which is a really exciting thing. Today, I'm going to be chatting with you about the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, which is a brand new observatory, great big one. It has about a light collecting area of just shy of 30 feet. And it's being built in Chile, and it's actually really exciting to talk to people about it because I've been working off and on this project since the mid-aughts, 2005, 2008, when I was in graduate school. And it's a project, my involvement, I brought it with me to Monmouth, and it's about to go live, and I'm super duper excited about having the next generation of Monmouth College students being able to interact with this thing. Another way of saying this is that really kind of a better title for my talk is just, Adventures with the Big Telescope. So, a little bit of what I want to chat about, and then plenty of time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about astronomy and surveys. Talk a little bit about this observatory itself, as well as what it means for the future of astronomy and seeing the sky, and just what people will have access to. One word of warning. So up until 2020, this project was known as LSST, which stood for the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. In 2020, we were officially renamed and given the name by the NSF, the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, and we kept LSST as now the Legacy Survey of Space and Time. So throughout today, if I use the words LSST and Rubin, I'm going to use them kind of interchangeably because I spent a decade saying LSST and only 2 years saying Rubin, and I'm still kind of adjusting to all of that. But just wanted to lay it out there. For today, they're going to mean the exact same thing. I'm an astronomer. This is a liberal arts college because I'm the astronomer who will occasionally quote Proust or Aristotle or things like that. I went to Reed College. I went to a liberal arts college. I love the liberal arts. That's why I'm here. I wanted to teach at a college like Monmouth here. And this quote kind of sums up what I'm going to talk about here really nicely, is that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And that's really what this observatory is going to be. It's going to be a whole new set of eyes. And really the whole history of astronomy is a history of us getting new eyes. Because if we think about what our eyes are, right, we have fundamental limits. Up until about 1600, all astronomy was done by this instrument right here. Well, not this one. This one's only been around since the 1970s. But this instrument right here, it has an aperture of just a few millimeters and can only collect light for about 1/30th of a second. And that's what we can see. And using that, you can see a couple thousand stars in the sky, a number of planets, and comets when they get close enough to us. In 1600, or in the 1600s, telescopes were invented. And with this brand new eye, we're still limited by our own biological eye, but now we can expand our pupil out to inches to feet. And that's really what you can think of as a telescope. A telescope is really just making your eyeball a lot larger. So instead of collecting all of the light through a little tiny hole, you're now collecting the light that's passing through this entire instrument, and you're able to see that. And with that new set of eyes, people like Galileo were able to see brand new things. When they looked at patches of sky, they saw innumerable stars that had never been seen before. They saw phases of Venus that had never been seen before. They saw mountains and craters on the moon that had never been seen before. They saw the moons of Jupiter, later the moons of Saturn. We saw all sorts of things that had never been seen before ever in history by having new eyes. Another type of new eye we got were photographic plates. This takes care of that idea that we can only collect light for 1/30th of a second with our eyes. The very first astrophoto ever taken was by John Draper in 1840. That blurry little weird thing there, that's the moon. But it's the first one ever taken. 1840, I mean, they're barely taking photographs of anything at all, so it's pretty gosh darn impressive. By the 1880s, John Draper's son, Henry Draper, was really getting good with astrophotography. 1880, he took this image of what is the Orion Nebula, and by 1882, it's getting recognizable. I mean, if you show that to an amateur astronomer, that 1882 image, they'll recognize that as the Orion Nebula. It's what it looks like through a small telescope. By taking photographs, what we can do now is that we can collect light for a huge length of time, and we can then do things with that. We can look at them later. We can do all sorts of things with it, and we learn things that we'll never learned before. Edwin Hubble used photographic plates on a telescope and discovered the expansion of the universe. Vera Rubin used photographic plates on a telescope and discovered that galaxies were behaving as if they were way more massive than they should be. This is the beginnings of the idea of dark matter. That's actually Vera Rubin's connection. This telescope is highly connected with the two big cosmological mysteries of dark energy and dark matter, and all of that starts with Vera Rubin. In the 1980s, we got a new set of eyes again, CCD cameras. The same sort of thing that's in your camera phone. Astronomers were really some of the very first kind of public users of CCD cameras. The first users were, of course, the military for spy satellites and things like that. But with these CCD cameras, now they're digital. We don't have to worry about photographic plates. We don't have to worry about film with messy chemicals. We just have digital pictures of things. I mean, think about like, back in the day, you had a camera, you had 12 pictures on that roll of film, and you had to be careful with what you did with that. Now, I can take 12 pictures every second, not like any of them, take another 12, and another 12, and another 12, and another 12. And that has really allowed us to dramatically improve what we've been able to see and observe. We can put things in like the Hubble Space Telescope, which has taken this amazing picture on your right there, is the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. This is what you get when you let a space telescope stare at a tiny patch of sky for around 100 hours. In that picture, there are 5 stars in our galaxy. Every other bit of light you're seeing is a whole other galaxy, like the Milky Way. Another way of saying it is that every little speck of light you see in that picture is about 200 billion stars. So yeah, it's one of those images, you just bring this image up and you just get lost in it. So, but what makes the Rubin Observatory, LSST, a new set of eyes? It's under construction in Chile, it's about to go live. It by far is not going to be the world's largest telescope in any way, shape, or form. It is being built at like an 8.5 meter, or about 30 foot, which means that the main mirror of it would sort of fill this room nicely. But that's about the size of current cutting-edge research telescopes. The brand new cutting-edge research telescopes that are being built are really big. They're 30 meters across. The Giant Magellan telescope is going to be 30 meters across. The aptly named 30-meter telescope is going to be 30 meters across. And the Europeans, just to outdo the 30-meter telescope, or TMT was a good acronym, they called theirs the ELT, which is going to be the extremely large telescope. This is building on the fact that they already have the VLT, which is the very large telescope. There were plans for a while for a really big one called the overwhelmingly large telescope. I'm not joking, by the way, this is real. We just ran out of ideas to name things there. What's different about LSST is that it's going to have the world's largest camera. It's designed to do something fundamentally different than these others. And then also up there I have the James Webb Space Telescope, which is a 6-meter telescope, but it's in outer space. It's the one that's kind of the next generation Hubble that has just started taking wonderful, wonderful data for us. LSST and Rubin is fundamentally different because while people were observing these very specific things, there were also collections of people dating all the way back to Hipparchus in 150 BCE who were surveying things. They were making maps. They were just counting stars, marking positions. They weren't studying individual objects. And even through the era of telescopes and then on into photography, it was still important to make these guidebooks of the sky. These were your finding charts. If you wanted to go observe something weird and spectacular, you would figure out where it was based off of these surveys. In the 1950s, the first large, almost all sky photographic survey came out. This was the Palomar Observatory Sky Survey. It was put together in the 1950s. What it did is over at the Palomar Observatory, they took basically 2 pictures of every patch of the sky, one in the red, one in the blue, so you get kind of a 2-color image there. You can tell something was more blue or more red. For example, this is the Pleiades cluster, which is a famous star cluster kind of in the tail of Taurus the Bull. On the right-hand side, that black and white picture is the blue light from that nebula, and that group of young stars in nebula, and on the left is the red light, and if you look at it, it's kind of blue, so it's not too surprising that the blue bit is a little bit brighter. In the 2000s, we upgraded and made a dedicated telescope, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, or SDSS. It did the same sort of thing that Palomar did, but it did it in 5 colors over a 10-year period and imaged the whole sky. So you can think of what the Sloan really did with this 2.5-meter telescope is that it made a digital color image of the sky. It took a digital picture of the whole sky. It's also just kind of a cool looking telescope. It's kind of weird and square with baffles on it. So Sloan, which was really interesting, was originally designed to be an extragalactic survey, which means Sloan was designed to study galaxies beyond our own. But to do so, it just wanted to observe all of them. So it took this whole massive picture of the sky, but then people figured out, it's like, well, you just took a whole picture of the sky, there's a lot more than galaxies in the sky. So even though it was designed as an extragalactic survey, it gave us fantastic information on stars, on nebula, on the structure of our own galaxy, the Milky Way. We discovered thousands upon thousands of asteroids, comets, and solar system objects. We learned things about fundamental cosmology. Sloan, by virtue of just observing everything and then making that data public, produced over 10,000 scientific papers, directly used the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, and the data has been referenced and used in almost 500,000 scientific papers, making it one of the most successful astronomical instruments ever built, right up there with Hubble and the Apollo moon landings. I kind of have a soft spot for it because honestly this telescope is why I'm standing here before you. I used it to do my PhD dissertation. Data from that telescope, I found comets, which are definitely not galaxies. So I spent a lot of time digging through this data, finding comets, this little orbit here. This is I gotta pat myself on the back. When you have a chance to humble brag, I discovered a comet. So right now it's at my Saturn. A round of applause for that. Nice, thank you. But anyway, so this was from my PhD dissertation. I used this telescope in a way no one had ever imagined it being used before. No one even thought about comets when it was being designed. So what is LSST going to do? Well, first off, it's going to be in the southern hemisphere. Sloan is in Arizona, so it's actually imaging a sky that we recognize. It's in Chile. Chile is really nice. The Andes are super high. It's near the Atacama Desert. It rarely rains. The infrastructure's there. But the idea with LSST is that, well, that digital color picture was really nice. Why don't we make a bigger telescope and make a digital color movie? So that not only do we have everything in the sky, but we also have how everything in the sky changes and moves over the course of 10 years. And that's the main kind of new eyes that Rubin is going to give us. We call it time domain astronomy. Essentially, you can think about that the goal is to basically produce this 10-year-long digital movie, this Sloan Digital Sky Survey. We're going to produce that every week for 10 years. And then be able to add all those images together to go even deeper or to see how things change. And it's going to be public. So let's just kind of look at what we're looking at in terms of new eyes here. So in the 1950s, the Palomar Observatory Sky Survey, here is a patch of sky observed by POS. That same patch of sky viewed by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, digital camera, slightly larger telescope, you can see more detail. You have more colors. Obviously, Rubin has not started taking data yet, but we have telescopes that can observe down to the depth of Rubin, and we will look at this same patch of sky through a telescope like Rubin. This is what you see. So we're going to get the entire sky looking like that every week for 10 years. Now, we really designed this telescope, just like Sloan was designed around extragalactic. We chose, or I say we, like I'm like deeply involved in it. There are hundreds of people who have worked on Rubin, and they are brilliant, hard-working individuals. And I could name them all, but then that would be the entire talk, and it would be kind of boring. Rubin is designed to achieve 4 things. We'll come back to this later. It's designed to explore the nature of dark energy and dark matter. In other words, cosmology, how the universe moves and grooves. It's designed to explore the transient universe. In other words, what changes? Stars that explode, pulsate, bump around. It's designed to map the Milky Way and to identify numerous little tiny asteroids, comets, and whatnot. And we want to do this all with a single instrument and a single data set. So the main driving factor behind Rubin is this idea of being wide, fast, and deep. It needs to swallow the sky very deeply, very rapidly. By deep, when an astronomer says deep, that means that real faintness. So that's what we're saying back previously with all the detail in the image. That's a deep image. So you're seeing very, very faint things, but you need to do this very, very quickly. So what sort of hardware is required to do this? The new eye, the Rubin Observatory, is an 8.5-meter mirror. It's actually a set of 3 mirrors, which is about 27.5 feet across. It has a camera about the size of a car that weighs a couple tons. It's the world's largest digital camera. It's 3.2 gigapixels, or if you were selling it as a camera phone, that'd be what, 3,200 megapixels, or about 200 iPhones. The whole thing is mounted in a 300-ton telescope that is inside a mountaintop fortress. It will produce 500 petabytes of data, which is about 500,000 hard drives. So you're not going to be walking around with this on a thumb drive. And it involves hundreds of people. So this is one of the coolest things for me to see. Again, having been involved with this when this was just being drawn on napkins, that's real. That's on top of a mountain. That's on top of Sierra Pachon in Chile. That is the site. A little bit of South America there on the left, Santiago in Chile. The nearest city is La Serena. It's about a 50-mile drive from La Serena out to the base facility of the mountain, and then it's a little bit of a mountain road up to the top of this thing. I love it. I mean, all you gotta do is like put a little logo like Superman sucks across the side of it, and you believe that like Lex Luthor built this. It just, you know, it just looks like a supervillain lair. I mean, come on, right? It's awesome. I love it. The telescope itself is weird looking. It's very squat, it's very fast. The idea is that it needs to tile the sky really fast. It needs to go picture, 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 picture. So it can go from one imaging spot to another, and it finishes taking a picture, it moves, and in 5 seconds it'll move and be ready to take a new picture. And this is something that's about 300 tons. So the fact that it moves and then it stops and gets just rock still is astounding. Actually, how fast is it? It can make a 90-degree turn in about 9 seconds. Which, I mean, okay, 90 degrees is like that, and I just did it pretty quickly, but when you're 300 tons, that's pretty impressive. The mirror system is kind of, it's a 3-mirror system, but there's actually only 2 pieces of glass. This is kind of, I'm going to worry about that. You've got a main mirror, way up at the top is the secondary mirror, and then a third mirror that then bounces it up to the stuff that's floating in the middle. Those are supposed to be the lenses for the camera there. And that's actually one of the mirror blanks being made at the University of Arizona. University of Arizona, under the sports field, has that's one of the reasons why there's so many 8.5-meter telescopes, because that's the biggest blank the University of Arizona has. This was the blank before they started grinding it, taken in 2008. And the man in the Hawaiian shirt sitting in the middle, that was my PhD advisor, Jelko Vezic, who's the science director of the project, hence why I got involved in this. So this picture is why I'm here. The camera, what's being held there is to scale the size of the CCD chip that's taking the data. That's what's actually being recorded. The full moon would show up at that size on it there. It's been built. It was a Department of Energy project, and they've been testing the thing out. They've got the whole thing assembled, and I think they're working on the last bits of the cryogenics. To make this thing work really, really well, they basically submerge the whole thing in liquid nitrogen. Keep it nice and cold so that there's no extra little thermal things. We have a real hard time dealing with billions. It's a big number, right? What does 3.2 billion pixels really mean? So say we took a picture with this camera, and it has 3.2 billion pixels, and you wanted to display it at full resolution on a TV screen. You'd need 1,500 HD TVs, which conveniently would fit on the side of a building there. And it's going to take 2 million of these images. Another way, say you wanted to print, another way of visualizing, say you wanted to print this at 72 DPI, which is sort of a standard, not real high-res printing, but you know, decent printing, you would need a piece of paper the size of 3 tennis courts. No single person is ever going to see every picture taken by this telescope. So, which is kind of, field of view, it's going to swallow the sky at about the size, it's going to take in about 40 full moons at a time. So you just took the full moon and took 40 of them. That's the focal. That's how much light this telescope's collecting each image, yet it has enough resolution that it can spot a golf ball at about 15 miles. it's just like I say these things and I don't believe them either, right? Yeah. Billions of objects, trillions of measurements. Again, not a single person's ever going to look at no one's going to be processing this. It's all going to be automated. Every single object is going to be detected and analyzed and given about 1,000 data points of measurements per image. Not per image, per object. So there's an overwhelmingly large, and this is why I'm saying that it's 500,000 hard drives to store this here. One of the things that it's going to do, because it's going to be automatically processing this, is that it's going to let people know when weird things happen. And the way it's going to do that is kind of cool. It's going to, every time it takes an image, it's going to subtract off that image from what it knows that bit of sky looks like, what the sky looked like last time. So at the top, we have an image where nothing has changed. If you subtract one from the other, the image on the right, there's nothing but just kind of static there. On the other hand, the images right below it, there was something new. You get that little black dot because you subtracted out something that was in one image but not the other. And that will trigger an alert. They'll be sent out online, and people who are interested in that type of event will be alerted within 60 seconds of the telescope taking that picture. It's going to produce anywhere from 1 to 10 million of these alerts each night. So, by the way, all this is going to be public. It's going to be open. This really is your telescope. This is your children's telescope. This is your grandchildren's telescope. This is your great-grandchildren's telescope. It will be their grandchildren's telescope. This data is public. From the minute-by-minute alerts all the way through the yearly catalogs, all the data will be public. All the processing software is free and open. You can go online and install it on your laptop if you want to. I'm not sure why you'd want to, but you could. And all the science is going to be done by the community, by people. Not necessarily those of us who've been working on this thing since the 2000s, but everybody. It's a telescope for the world. And it's going to make us think differently about the universe. This is Vera C. Rubin when she was a college student at Vassar in the 1940s. And it's just a really nice quote from her that sort of encompasses this new idea. I was more interested in the question than the answer. I decided that at an early age we inhabit a very curious world. And this really represents this fundamental change to astronomy that Rubin is going to make. Traditionally, wrong arrow, traditionally astronomy was a data-starved science. Like if I wanted to study a comet, here's how I have to go about studying a comet. I find a comet I want to study, I write a proposal to a funding agency to get time on a telescope, they review it, they get back to me, they give me that time, I cross my fingers that it's not raining that day, and then I try to take the data. With Rubin, the idea is you're not necessarily looking for a thing, it's like here's all your data, what can you do with it? Here's everything. We just took a picture of everything for you. Go crazy nuts. It's going to deliver the positions and magnitudes and variable information for virtually everything in the southern sky down to crazy, crazy faint limits. And to horribly mangle, paraphrasing JFK, ask not what data you need to do your science, ask what science you can do with your data. This is sort of the paradigm shift that we're going to be dealing with here. I just want to return now to those 4 science drivers on what LSST is going to produce for those 4 bits of science. Mapping the Milky Way. We want to map out the Milky Way. We're going to observe the Milky Way because the distribution of stars in our galaxy tells us fundamentally how our galaxy came together. How did our galaxy form? Did it form from one massive cloud of gas that kind of collapsed and fragmented? Or did it form from a lot of little things coming together to form a big thing? Well, all of those dynamics are still hidden within the stars we see today. To be able to tease out that answer, LSST will take measurements over 10 years of 20 billion stars. You want to explore the transient sky. This is things like supernovas, exploding stars, stars that slowly pulsate, get brighter and dimmer, and weird things. Not to mention brand new things that no one has ever seen before because it's rarely happening, but by observing this whole sky again and again and again and again and again, we can catch these very, very rare events. And to do so, we're going to be observing anywhere from 1 to 10 million transient events each night. Cosmology, the universe itself. We live in a very odd universe. It expands, it accelerates, and we can come up with some really nice physics theories that model the universe really, really, really well. The problem is that we have to posit two things that we know very little about and might not actually exist. So one of the goals of Rubin is to observe so many distant galaxies that we can start teasing out the structure of the universe and make detailed measurements of the acceleration of the universe, the expansion of the universe, and try to put some limits on various ideas people have of turning these theoretical objects of dark energy and dark matter into real things that we can test, real things that we can probe, real things that we can potentially discover. And to do so, we're going to observe about 20 billion galaxies, which gives us 10 billion years of the history of the universe. When you're looking at something that's really, really distant, these galaxies, when you're looking at a galaxy that is 8 billion light years away, it's much better to think about that is what galaxies looked like 8 billion years ago. Because light travels at the speed of light. What do we call the speed of light? Light travels at the speed of light, which means that a galaxy that's 8 billion light years away from us, that light has taken 8 billion years to reach us. So we are seeing that galaxy as it was, not as it is. So it's beautiful. The universe is also a time machine. You just need to look further and further back. And finally, we want to inventory the solar system. Very similar to inventorying mapping the Milky Way. This isn't necessarily the planets, this is all the asteroids and comets and Kuiper belts objects out there. We're going to observe millions of them. For the same sorts of reasons, we want to know how our solar system came together. The small bodies of the solar system, asteroids and comets, really map out both how the solar system can and had to exist. This is wonderful. You have an idea of how it works. Have you heard of the friendly floaties? This is lovely. This was sort of a weird accident that actually produced some interesting science. In 1992, a shipping container full of bathtub toys capsized up near the between Alaska and Siberia. And since 1992, these little bathtub toys have been floating around through the global ocean and washing up on shores, and people have actually been able to use when and where the friendly floaties wash up to help map out ocean currents. In a similar way, the asteroids and comets give us the same sort of information about our solar system, how our solar system evolves and moves and changes around. Inventorying the solar system also gives us the nice public bit of saving the Earth. The Earth lives in a busy place in the solar system. The blue ball is the Earth, and then all the yellow and green balls near it are the positions on one particular day of known asteroids that are near us. Not to scale, they aren't really that big. These are all really, really small things. But, you know, these things come by. We see shooting stars all the time. About once every 100 years, something like Chelyabinsk happens. In 2013, a large meteor came into the atmosphere and exploded over Siberia. Every 100 million years or so, something even bigger, something about the size of Mount Everest, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago. Kind of important for us because that wiped out the dinosaurs and let our squirrel-like ancestors conquer the world. So, you know, as mammals listening to a talk in a room, this was a very important event for us. It'd be kind of nice to find the next one so that we don't have to turn it over to, I don't know, the ants or the cockroaches or maybe, you know, the squirrels again, right? And you can also find rare and exotic things. There are asteroids that behave like comets that we've only known about for about 10 years. For only about 4 or 5 years, we've discovered a handful of comets that we're pretty sure originate outside of our solar system. So there's all sorts of cool things. By the way, I'm talking more about the solar system stuff because that's what I work on. So, unbiased. All right. But anyways, what we're going to do with LSST, we're going to get a sense of the solar system. Millions of asteroids, hundreds of thousands of other objects. And the statistic that blows me away is that we are physically going to take 20 times the number of observations of asteroids and comets that have been taken in all of human history. Every picture of an asteroid or a comet, we're going to produce 20 of them from one survey over 10 years. So yeah, we're entering an age of an abundance of high quality data here. We want to know what and how to ask our questions. And this observatory and the data from it is really designed to make us think differently about things. Instead of trying to find something to test our theory, we're going to try to figure out what theories fit our data. And it's just kind of a new way of doing things. And the biggest, most exciting thing is that we can't even prognosticate what's going to come out of this survey. My PhD dissertation on comets in the Longitudinal Sky Survey wasn't even an afterthought of the people who built that telescope. We have no idea. Probably the most exciting things that are going to come out of LSST are things that we haven't even thought about over the last decade and change. In a real sense, here's 10 years with 40 billion science objects. Go crazy nuts. And I really do mean this. This is going to be public. They're still working on some of the public interfaces. There are going to be very high-end scientific interfaces that look very boring. We're just downloading spreadsheets, basically. But there's also going to be some interactive, kind of browser-based. This is going to essentially be a world telescope. You can log into it. You can browse around with it. You can view it on your phone, on your computer. There's a whole group that's working on education and public outreach that are working on activities to bring this into the classroom, integrating it into textbooks, things like that. I mean, really, in 2 words, it's huge. It's absolutely huge. Turning now to probably the most obvious question, it's like, when is this fantastic thing going to start? Well, funny, if you open my dissertation, there is a plot that says first light, which is when they open up the telescope to the sky, was going to happen in April of 2015. It's what, 2020? Okay, we sort of missed that one, but yeah, that's what happens when you have government funding and things like that. You do things right? If someone's going to give you millions and millions of dollars, you do it right. I'm an astronomer. I am contractually obligated to at least have one Star Wars reference in every talk I give. Commissioning, by the end of this year, by December, they are going to start commissioning. In other words, working out the calibrations, taking test images. Everything will be on the mountain. They will open it up to the sky, and they will start taking images, not for the sake of science, but for the sake of engineering and testing and making sure we know how everything works and moves and operates. And by just about a year and a month from today is when the actual LSST survey should begin. Now, knowing how this works, since they actually have to point the telescope at the sky for all this commissioning data, we're trying right now to make sure that they commission the telescope on, say, interesting bits of the sky, so we can get some science out early, because we've been waiting a really long time to use this. And if we can start doing that in December instead of next July, that would be awesome. But yeah, that's the current status of the project. It's absolutely mind-blowing to me that it actually exists as a real building. The mirror I saw while it was being ground in Arizona. This is amazing. I'm really excited that really almost starting next year, I'm going to have students who are going to be able to work on this with me, which is just amazing. At all different things. To let Vera sum it up once more, the joy and fun of understanding the universe we bequeath to our grandchildren and to their grandchildren. With over 90% of the matter in the universe still to play with, even the sky will not be the limit. There's so much we don't know. That's why I tell my astronomy students every year. It's like I have the greatest job in the world, because every day I wake up, I go, what won't I know by the end of the day? What am I wrong about today? Being wrong is all about science. We learn things. We learn amazing things. The other cool thing about being attached to a major NSF-funded project is that you have people who can make really cool promotional videos. So I will let a kind of this just kind of tears me up, but this is really kind of cool.
Of our imagination unfold in the darkness ready to be discovered. When we look at the night sky, we see into the past. Untold stories carried through space by light, the great historian of the cosmos. Technology has evolved over centuries, allowing us to look farther, to the edge of our horizon. We invented telescopes to explore and cameras to capture these traveling messages. Yet the changing cosmos remains unseen. A new telescope opens its eye and captures it all. The objects that move and those that flash, even those we cannot see with our eyes. Every few nights it covers the sky, finding all that has changed. And within minutes, new glimmers of activity are carried around the earth to anyone waiting to explore them. What will you discover that no one has seen before? It's time to find out.
Okay, because the microphone and the video are at very different audio levels. Thank you all, and I will be happy to answer some questions. I try to leave some time for questions because any single aspect of that, I mean, we could really talk about for a really long time, so, yeah.
One of the things that we all worry about in some fashion is all this stuff hurtling through space at Earth. How many studies or what are the current studies are taking place to find when the next collision occurs?
So they're currently undergoing, there's two big projects that have a major component of that underway right now. So Rubin really is partially designed to satisfy a congressional mandate to identify and classify 90% of all the potentially hazardous asteroids over 150 meters. And that size is about when you run from, gosh, that was a bad day, to, gosh, that was a devastating day. And then there's another, I believe it's called NEOSat, which is a orbital satellite that will have the advantage of being able to look in directions that ground-based telescopes can. So those two projects together are going to be very complementary and should do a real good job of getting things down to, well, about as good as we can. There's always a way of hiding something, having it come in like right from the sun, because you can't point a telescope at the sun. It's just too bright. You're not going to see anything if it's coming at you directly from kind of the sun there. Right now, we have a fairly good accounting of, I would say we have a fairly good accounting of almost all of the things that would sort of like end life as we know it. Like rocks that are like, there's nothing to do other than throw Bruce Willis at it and cross our fingers. The goal is now to kind of get the smaller ones as well. And the idea is that if we can really identify all of these things, we can work on redirecting them. There actually was a recent NASA mission, the DART mission, the Double Asteroid Redirect Test, because we love our acronyms. What they went in is they went into outer space and they threw a refrigerator at an asteroid and measured how much they altered the orbit of the asteroid, so they can use that in their calculations, because that's honestly one of the simplest ways to move an asteroid is just throw stuff at it. You don't want to break it apart because then you have a whole lot of stuff coming at you. But all you have to do is nudge it a little bit. It's ridiculously hard to predict. The Earth, if you think about where the Earth is, the Earth moves an entire Earth diameter every 7 minutes. So to really know if an asteroid is going to hit us, we need to know its orbit down to about a 7-minute cadence. So it's tough to do. But yeah, no, people are working on it, and we are, these two instruments over the next decade should get us to that sort of 93% threshold for identifying these potentially hazardous objects.
But there's nothing imminent right
No. And you know it's not eminent. So this idea that people say, oh, you're gonna hide it from us, like, no, we're astronomers. We spoil like award ceremonies with cakes by accident, right? You wanna know why no astronomer is ever gonna keep a secret from you? If there was an asteroid coming towards the Earth, all of a sudden we get the military budget. Okay? If my science can suddenly save the planet, I don't have to worry about funding anymore. So, yeah, no, there is nothing that we have to worry about eminently. So, because yeah. If we want like odds, I think it's like you're more likely to be attacked by a shark 10 times than something dramatically hit us in the next year. So.
We have a lot of space junk up there and a lot of satellites.
Yeah.
You've got to look through all of that to do your photography out of the LSST.
Yes.
How does that work?
Here, let me show you. It's our newest issue that we didn't think about at all when we were putting this together. So there's a lot of space junk up there. But the brightest stuff that's been going up are a bunch of low Earth satellites. This is a rendering of SpaceX's Starlink.
Yeah.
But it's not just Starlink that's putting up tens of thousands of these things. Amazon has a thing. There's, I think, about 24 international companies that are planning on putting up these satellite constellations. They have effects on the night sky. At the current rate, by 2030, about 1 out of every 10 objects you see in the evening and morning sky is going to be an artificial satellite and not a star or a planet. And that's with your naked eye. I'm not sure if it's going to come over. This is a picture. You can't really see it, but in the middle, oh wait, there is a little tiny white streak sort of in the center left there. That is one of these constellation satellites going overhead that's visible. Now what happens when that goes over a large CCD detector? Well, if they're faint, it just looks like this. So all of those little white streaks are satellites, and we don't get any data anywhere near them. But that's okay. We can sort of just, basically blanket out and work around it. So occasionally we lose the observation of something, which is going to be kind of sad if it was the only time that thing happened in 10 years. But, it is living. The issue really is that some of these things like Starlink are very bright and can actually bloom out the CCD. When you put something that's you can see with your naked eye into a 30-meter telescope, it gets really, really, really bright. Thankfully, actually, Rubin and Starlink actually sat down and worked together, and the current and next generations of Starlink, they're actually darkening them, which brings them just below the limit of completely frying the telescope like this one would. So, but it's something that we worry about. It's problematic not just for Rubin, but for every ground-based observation. It's even a problem just for humanity. I mean, it's kind of like, are you okay with that, right? Are you okay with 1 out of every 10 things you see in the sky being an artificial satellite that's put up there to give you kind of low-rate satellite internet, right? So, yeah, no, we worry about it a lot. Yes?
On one of your slides, there was a schematic of the solar system,
Yes.
and you had all the planets in their orbits and the asteroid belt.
Yeah.
And there was a mass between either Earth and Venus or Earth and Mars that was not in an orbit.
Oh, this one here? Well, let me actually. Yeah. This one here?
What is that one?
Okay, let me see, because
Between Earth and Mars.
that's the moon. I got this out of the website for an introductory astronomy text. So it's not supposed to be to scale or anything. It's just I wanted a picture of the solar system that showed things. Yeah. So the small bodies, there are a number of potentially hazardous asteroids that live in this region. This is the main asteroid belt. What's not shown is that there's also clusters of asteroids that orbit just ahead and just behind Jupiter. There are centaurs, which orbit between Jupiter and the outer worlds, comets, which travel all over the place, and then far out beyond this, up there would be the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud. But at that point, it kind of just becomes, word salad. But yeah, no, these are, honestly, it's word salad, but it's what I spend all my research time on.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, this is a cartoon. So, yeah. Yes?
I noticed you're not depicting Pluto. Is that no longer considered a planet?
No. Shouldn't have ever been. Yeah, no, Pluto's an interesting thing. Nothing changed, by the way. Pluto, I mean, we still send a probe by it. We have amazing pictures of Pluto. The story of Pluto is really kind of interesting, and it mimics the discovery of kind of the first asteroids. When Ceres, the first asteroid, was discovered in 1801, it was considered a planet. In fact, if you opened an astronomy textbook from the 1850s, you'd find that there were about 11 planets, because they were including the planets out through Uranus, because Neptune had not been discovered yet, but they also had the 4 largest asteroids. In fact, up until about when Psyche was discovered, which is asteroid 17 or 19, I forget the exact number, they were considering them planets, but they realized, like, wait, we're up to like 27 planets, and that's a little bit ridiculous, so we're just gonna call them asteroids. The main issue so Ceres was basically a planet for about 50 years, Pluto was considered a planet for about 70 years. What really happened is that we started finding other objects out by Pluto in the 1990s that were as big, and even there's one that's a little bit bigger than Pluto. And it's like, okay, and then we had this sort of uh-oh moment where we realized that we are planetary scientists, and there is no scientific definition of the word planet. So we had to come up with one. And it was going to make people angry no matter what we did. But they erred on the side of keeping planets something rare. There's kind of a threefold definition. There's a whole hullabaloo. There were a lot of articles written about it. But Pluto is now officially a dwarf planet, as is Ceres. So things that are kind of large, like things that orbit amongst a bunch of other stuff, but are big enough to be round, we call them dwarf planets now. This sort of mimics what we call with stars. We have stars and dwarf stars and giant stars. It's kind of a, it's mainly that they discovered Pluto, and then the second Pluto wasn't found for another 70 years. As opposed to Ceres was discovered, and they found another Ceres in just a year or two afterwards. Plus, Disney named the dog after it, so that didn't help anything. But it really, honestly, it's a label. At a certain point in doing science, you have to draw some boxes to sort stuff into. And to be perfectly frank, nature doesn't care what boxes you make. The moment you make a box, nature is going to make an object that makes it, like, so, you say planet versus asteroid, nature gives you Pluto. You say planet, star, nature gives you a brown dwarf, which is something the size of Jupiter, but if you squint at it with one eye, it looks like Jupiter. If you squint at it with the other eye, it looks like the sun. So at a certain point, it's really just, to keep your sanity. You gotta come up with some labels, because at a certain point you have to, classify things to make stuff. But yeah, it's.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it was called the New Horizons spacecraft that flew past Pluto.
Absolutely.
Is that still operating?
Yes. I don't know what it's currently doing. I know after they flew past Pluto, they ran a campaign and they found another very small Kuiper Belt object that it flew past. It was only like 50 miles across or so forth. It is still doing some things. I can't remember offhand exactly what it's doing. I don't think there's any plans for it to be able to visit anything else, because they haven't been able to find anything else in its path, because finding these objects out there, other than Pluto and a few others, a lot of them have the reflectivity of a piece of charcoal, which at billions of miles away from the sun does not reflect very much, so it's really hard to find these things. But no, New Horizons is still functional. I apologize, I don't know off the top of my head what its current activities are. Yeah.
Have they found Bongo? Yeah, Flash Gordon.
Oh! That would be cool, right? It's the same thing with like life. If we find life, you'd know about it, because all of a sudden they become very, very interesting. Yeah. Yes?
Kind of a two-part question.
Yeah.
us anticipated overwhelming our ability to collect all the data that's going to come? And if that, also the other question is why once a week instead of once every 5 days or once a month?
So it's closer to a 5 to 4 day thing, but there's factoring in for bad weather and things like that. So we actually have an entire survey simulator. What we did is we took they took a 10-year period of time, and they used the actual weather at the mountain to be able to predict, like, okay, so essentially we have a fake survey that we ran from the years of like 1990 to 2000. I can't remember the exact years. It's a matter of technology. In fact, actually, this is something that, like, when we were talking about this project in the aughts, when I was in grad school, it was kind of one of these things like, well, we can't do this today, but by the time this thing is built, hard drives are going to be big enough to store this. We're going to have telecommunications is going to be good enough to do this, right? It's only really now today that we can pull off this sort of big data project. And there's a lot of other big data projects as well. So things like the Human Genome Project, the Massive Particle Accelerator in Europe, CERN produces this type of data. Honestly, by the time, when we were proposing LSST, it was one of the largest collections of data ever imagined. By the time it goes live, it's going to be a large data collection, but it really won't be, top of the mountain in terms of big data anymore, which is utterly mind-blowing. But no, a good modern computer with a decent amount of RAM can sort through a lot of this right now. You do always have to worry about that, right? If we tried to do this project to collect this much data, say back in 1980, there's no way you could do it at all, right? And just other things like the maps that they made of the moon to identify some of the lunar landing spots were taken by, this was in the 60s, so there weren't digital cameras then, which means they actually had a photographic emulsion film in outer space taking pictures. It was actually a very early version. I remember the Polaroid, right, the Instamatic. It was sort of like that. So the space program would take it, it would develop it right there, and then it was essentially at a very low baud rate fax machine. It would go back to Earth like that, essentially. So you're always limited by the technology of the time. I'm actually kind of like, hey, the technology caught up to the project, so it should be just fine. And in fact, actually, at the meetings we have, the way, even though algorithms we're using, we were counting on very, very, what we consider very, very crude amounts of machine learning and artificial intelligence algorithms. And the work that's been done on that has just absolutely exploded. And I don't know how many of the algorithms that we're using today, as we are about to start this project, how similar they are to the algorithms that were originally envisioned for the project. So I think someday someone's going to write a really interesting history of this whole project. And it's going to be a fascinating read for those exact questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of my question. You're taking pictures of Milky Way that does not exist. And so we're somewhere, in our scientists are thinking about compressing that time lapse, and that the data you're going to collect is immensely valuable. I'm not belittling that, but where's the future? Like, I mean, we're not going to be able to look at it instantly, probably.
Almost. So the data, the data releases are scheduled to be kind of a yearly data release, so that everything will be cleaned up and presented. But I think the public web portal should go live pretty quick in there, which means you can use, it's going to take a while because to image the entire southern sky, it's going to take an entire year because you can only look at night, right? So you got to wait for the seasons to roll through. So you're obviously not going to get all the data at once. No. And it's not going to be able to image the entire sky all at once. And actually going back to someone else about why a week is because we also are trying to balance taking all these pictures through 6 different filters to build a color pictures of all of these objects. So, I mean, there's more data than any one person can look at in their lifetime, but it's going to be there, and it's going to be accessible almost from day one. I don't know exactly the EPO, just the Education Public Outreach, just rolled out yesterday a brand new website. So I need to read through that and find all their new ideas because they've changed. That's also the kind of, everything changes. Like I said, every day I get to wake up and realize I'm wrong. I think, are we running out of time or are we? Okay, well, I thank all of you. This was really cool. Again,